Hello again. A number of people in the comments here have ticked me off in the past because I don't show enough sympathy for victims of British colonialism, uh, or even tacitly supporting the slave trade, supposedly. This is actually funny because I've written several books about British imperialism, and I'm generally known to be someone who's bitterly opposed to the practice of colonialism by the British in their empire. Um, this book here, British Concentration Camps, it details the use by the British of concentration camps in Africa, Malaya, Israel, Cyprus, Ireland, and so on. I've certainly made my feelings very plain on the subject. I can't help wondering if some of those people that criticise me have ever got around to writing books complaining about colonialism. But still, I just want to say that I'm not really a heartless imperialist, despite the moustache and general military bearing and so on. I want to talk today about a time when the British locked up hundreds of thousands of people in concentration camps. And these were real concentration. I want to explain for them, I'm not talking about death camps like Sobibor, Treblinka or Auschwitz. I'm talking about concentration camps, places where people are detained not for what they've done, but for who they are because of their ethnicity, religion, political beliefs and so on. So the concentration camps I'm talking about now, people were held there because of their ethnicity, because they belonged to a particular African tribe. In those camps, and they were proper concentration camps, they were surrounded with barbed wire, there were watchtowers and so on. Many people died from outbreaks of typhoid, just as those who were in Belsen did. Those who broke the rules in these camps were actually hanged in front of other prisoners. Again, just as you would expect to see in the Nazi concentration camps. They were truly shocking places. To begin with, here's the country where it all happened, Kenya. The British were very comfortably established in Kenya in the first half of the 20th century. In the area known as the White Highlands, the standard of living was superb for the white settlers. In the years following the end of the Second World War, though, things began to change in Kenya. An independence movement emerged, chiefly amongst members of the Kikuyu tribe. This was the Kenya Land and Freedom Army, although generally speaking people now call it the Mau Mau. There's some dispute as to the origin of the term Mau Mau. It's been claimed that it's an anagram of the Kiswahili Amu Amu, meaning get out, but I don't know how true that is. Some people find the term Mau Mau offensive, but if I start talking about the KLFA, no one's going to know who I mean, so I'll refer to the Mau Mau throughout this. Most of the fighters of the Mau Mau were armed just with knives, some spears, a few pistols and rifles. They were very poorly armed. The British, of course, this was the colonial regime, were very heavily armed. They launched a war of extermination, which killed not only the fighters of the Mau Mau, but many innocent Africans as well. During the 8 years of the insurgency campaign between 1952 and 1960, 12,893 Africans were killed, as opposed to just 107 white Europeans. One of the reasons for this is that they used the RAF to bomb the forests where the Mau Mau fighters were hiding out. They used Lincoln bombers between 18th of November 1953 and 28th of July 1955. Lincoln bombers dropped 6 million bombs on the forests in Kenya. This, of course, is why the British Empire lasted so long. It was that absolute ruthlessness and determination at all costs to kill anybody that got in the way. This is a Lincoln bomber dropping bombs in Kenya. Hand in hand with the military assault on the bases of the rebels, which were in the forests, the capital was also placed under siege, and every black person living in Nairobi was arrested and interrogated. Anyone that was felt to be slightly dubious politically, that didn't show wholehearted support for the British colonial regime there, was deported to reserves, which were very much like the Bantustans of apartheid era, South Africa. Once they were there, they weren't left alone. They were kept in barbed wire stockade to stop them giving aid to the rebels. So, in effect, up to 1 million people were detained in special camps surrounded by barbed wire during the 1950s in Kenya. Those who were thought actually to be members of the Mau Mau, or the Kenya Land and Army Freedom Movement, were detained in special concentration camps, and the conditions there were absolutely atrocious. There was no sanitation apart from tin buckets. The water was often contaminated. There were outbreaks of typhoid, just as there were in German camps like Belsen. And because of the cramped conditions there, pulmonary tuberculosis was rife as well. Incidentally, the Swiss Red Cross tried for 2 years to get access to these concentration camps. The British wouldn't let them near them. According to the Swiss, these people were prisoners of war. They should have been under the protection of the Geneva Convention. But the British were always very prepared to play fast and loose with the Geneva Convention when it suited them. When the Red Cross did get there, they were absolutely appalled at the malnutrition and disease that they found. One of the worst of the camps was a place called Hola, and 500 of the hardcore, or so the British thought, of the Mau Mau fighters were held there. These people decided to adopt a policy of non-cooperation with the British. They modelled themselves on Gandhi. They decided they wouldn't fight back, they would peacefully disobey orders, because they felt that the British orders were illegal, which of course they were. The British expected these people to work, digging ditches, doing all sorts of things, building roads. The prisoners at Hola refused. And one morning, March the 3rd, 1959, the order was given by the guards to pick up their spades and go to work, and the prisoners simply sat down and refused to move, whereupon the commandant of the camp ordered the guards to beat them with pickaxe handles. 11 men were killed in the course of this business. Some were crippled, many had bones broken. It was one of the most shocking events in colonial history. It was known as the Hola massacre. Rumours eventually reached England of what was happening in the Kenyan concentration camps. The government was they managed to persuade some MPs that it was a lot of fuss about nothing. They demonised the Mau Mau and said that they were low grade. They used the expression subhuman for the prisoners in the camps in Kenya. And for a while it was as though they were going to get away with it, that people weren't going to make a fuss, that the government had persuaded them it was better for British interest to keep quiet. What blew the lid off it was the anger of one man. This was the Member of Parliament for Wolverhampton, a former Conservative minister who'd been a housing minister and financial secretary to the Treasury. He was determined that there would be no cover-up. His name was Enoch Powell. Powell was an extraordinary man. He was an academic originally. He was actually the youngest professor in the entire British Commonwealth at one time, Professor of Greek. He also had a great love of India. He was stationed there during the Second World War. He spoke Urdu fluently. He was tremendously keen on Indian culture. And he thought that the British attitude in Africa was absolutely scandalous. So, on July the 27th, 1959, despite all sorts of private appeals from the government, appeals to his patriotism and so on, Enoch Powell rose in the House of Commons and made a most passionate speech denouncing the atrocities at places like Hola Camp. Among other things, he said of the suggestion that the Mau Mau prisoners who had died were subhuman and their deaths therefore not important, well, not important enough to get worked up over, he said this: "In general, I would say that it is a fearful doctrine which must recoil upon the heads of those who pronounce it. To stand in judgment on a fellow human being and say, because he was such and such, therefore the consequences which would otherwise flow from his death shall not flow." When he had finished, the House was absolutely stunned into silence. At least one Labour MP thought the speech the finest he had ever heard in Parliament. Powell's speech had such a great effect that it signalled in effect the beginning of the end of the British presence in Africa. 4 years later, Kenya became an independent country. I've included a link to Powell's speech in Hansard, the official record of Parliament, and I would seriously recommend people to click on the link and read this speech, which had a tremendous effect on the history of Africa throughout the 1960s.